had to become a disadvantage to them, not an advantage to them. And so what Lincoln reasoned is that slavery as it existed, being protected in the South and not molested by the North, was an asset to the South. But if those slaves were liberated, then it would become a liability. Those slaves would be a liability to the South. So when it became clear that there was going to be no sort of negotiated settlement, that there was a fight to the finish, that this thing was going to go on and on and on, Lincoln came to the conclusion that the only way to defeat the South was with the slaves being free, not them being enslaved. And so, to bolster Northern public opinion, to bolster the defenses, in the Army, to undermine the strength of the South, he liberates the slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, okay, so now the slaves are liberated, the war is over, what becomes of them? Well, we said there is this gigantic dispute, right? Who is going to dictate what the status of the recently freed slaves is going to be? Is it going to be the national government, or is it going to be the states? Now, remember Lincoln prior to his death, and Johnson after Lincoln's death was quite willing to allow the status of the former slaves to be determined by the individual states. When Lincoln and Johnson allowed the status of the former slaves to be determined by the individual states, how did they respond? What series of laws do we remember? Go ahead, Melissa. The Black Codes. And the Black Codes reduced those former slaves to a level of second-class citizenship that may have just slightly been above slavery. Now, Northern Republicans and Northerners in general respond to the Black Codes with the 14th Amendment, saying, look, we won't accept a half abolition. If the slaves are free, then they are free, and that they deserve equal protection under the law just like anyone else. So, we are insisting that the South must ratify and live by the 14th Amendment. Now, we know that there was a period of time where Congress insisted that the former Confederate states do just that. What was that period of time called? That period of time where the Congress of the United States insisted that the South, the former Confederate states, live by the mandates of the 14th Amendment. Yes?
Radical Reconstruction.
Radical Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction. During Radical Reconstruction, African American males in the former Confederate states voted, participated in government, held office at a number of different levels. There were African Americans that served in the United States Senate, in the U.S. House of Representatives, as lieutenant governors, as speakers of houses of representatives, as legislators, as sheriffs, and in other positions. So this is a remarkable thing. I mean, on some level, for a people to be enslaved one day, and then in some cases in positions of authority, not just equal citizenship, but in positions of authority the next day, was a remarkable thing. Now, we said from the very start, the majority of white Southerners deeply, bitterly, angrily resented what they considered to be Northern interference in race relations. We said the symbol of that backlash against radical Reconstruction and this equality, political equality, was what organization? Yes, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, there were other organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, vigilante groups that attempted to sort of put this into place, but the Klan was the most famous. Now, the Klan is successful, and other groups like it, in eventually overturning radical Reconstruction and redeeming, and this is the word they use, redeeming white rule in the South. And we said that the official end is the Compromise of 77. Who becomes president, Ellen Parker, as a result of the Compromise of 77? Go ahead, Kendra.
Ulysses S. Grant.
No. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. Grant went out. It was Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, here's one you'll never get. Who did he run against?
Oh.
Whoa, good, bro. Tilden is correct. Nice work. Yes, Samuel Tilden. Whispering Sammy. Now, the likelihood of that being on the test is probably 0, right? But if it is, we're all over it, right? So this is called the Compromise of 77. Now, after the Compromise of 77, which makes Hayes the president, Hayes agrees to withdraw Southern troops from the South. Now we have this period of time where radical Reconstruction is gradually repealed. And what we said during this period of time is 85 to 90% of African Americans that lived in the United States lived in the former slave states. Let's call it the South. So 85 to 90% of African Americans lived in the South. What was true of that 85 to 90% of African Americans is that most of them suffered, well, I should say, most of them, the majority of them were politically disenfranchised. Now, what that means is that in one way or the other, they were prevented from participating in politics. Voting, holding office, and supporting candidates. Just tell me one way the white South was able to disenfranchise black voters. Yes?
Grandfather clause.
The grandfather clause. Tell me another way. What did you say? No, the one drop of blood rule meant that that's how you defined whether you were an African American. Yes?
Literacy test?
Literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clause are pretty successful in disenfranchising African Americans. We said they were also economically dependent. Economically dependent meant that many African Americans found themselves in situations of sharecropping, right? Where they lived and leased land of former plantation owners in return for a share of the crop. Oftentimes they were exploited. They were charged ridiculous interest rates. It was a cycle of poverty. And African Americans in the South and whites in the South were frequently impoverished. The South recovered slowly from the Civil War. The significant sort of phenomena that really accelerates in the 1890s is social segregation. And what we said social segregation meant was that what the white South created was two separate societies. A society for African Americans and a society for whites. And that society was legally sort of confined. You know, there were things that were reserved for whites and things that were reserved for African Americans. And in the South, there were signs that indicated white only, colored only, white only schools, colored only schools, white only water fountains, colored only water fountains. This seemed to be a blatant disregard for the 14th Amendment, which promised people equal protection under the law. However, when that issue was challenged in court, it was determined that separate facilities were acceptable, Jim, as long as they were equal. What was the case? No, what was the case? Wow, look at all the people. Whoever we are. Go ahead, Amo. Yes. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. 1896. That's the one drop thing. What do you call an eighth? An octarian? An octarine? When you're 1/8 of a nationality. Remember, I don't know what you say when you're 1/8. But remember, Plessy was 1/8 black. Right? Now, we said in that case, which is a national embarrassment, Plessy versus Ferguson is a national embarrassment. Segregation is constitutionalized. Now, I'm trying to think of the Atlanta Compromise, what year it was.
1895.
1895. In 1895, the Atlanta Compromise was proposed by Booker T. Washington. And the Atlanta Compromise was Booker T. Washington's response to segregation. What should we as the black community do about segregation? And Washington's suggestion to a white audience was to accept it, to accept segregation. Remember, his imagery was this segregation that is a part of Southern life by 1895 is is not necessarily acceptable, but is something that we can ignore for now. In